Hello, my name's Eleanor, and today we're going to be looking at word classes. So I'm going to be showing you some key terms related to the main 8 word classes as shown here. This might seem very basic to be doing, but it's very important to cover these very foundational key terms because examiners want confirmation that you know your stuff, so this is one easy way to show that. You should be using these key terms everywhere in your essays and analysis, and stop saying the word and. You should be saying the coordinating conjunction and. It just sounds so much more informed and better, and examiners want to see that. I'm going to be analysing a bit of an example text, so this is an extract of Alice in Wonderland. You might want to screenshot this or get a copy somehow to annotate this. But this is a great practice to be doing anyway with any extracts you find, just to pick out with all your key terms examples of them in different texts, because it means by the time you come to the exam you'll sort of know naturally, you'll have been in practice, you'll have got it flowing, so that when you get to exam you know it's very easy for you. So first of all, nouns. These are objects. But to be more specific, you can have proper nouns and common nouns. Proper nouns are capitalised generally in English. They're names of places and people and other things like that. And then there's common nouns, which are everything else. Concrete nouns are physical objects. So for example, table, chair, pen. Abstract nouns are intangible objects such as love, happiness and truth. And collective nouns are objects made up of a group of objects, so for example parliament, school, crew, gang. Some of these are specific to particular kinds of things, for example an unkindness of ravens, which is actually a book of collective nouns. Well, not all of them, but interesting ones, which I highly recommend. I've got it myself. It's not an ad, by the way. It's just a great fun read. And then let's look at the extract. So let's look at some proper nouns. So we've got Dormouse and Alice. I just want to point out, I'm not going to point out every single example of these key terms in this extract, but you can if you want to. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Something to note though is that Dormouse is generally a concrete noun, but here it's made into a proper noun, which is perhaps typical of children's books. Which would relate to mode. Now for concrete nouns, we've got teapot, trees, table, mushroom and fountains. Abstract nouns, we've got rudeness. Collective nouns, I haven't actually got any highlighted, but I think perhaps the wood would be one in the second paragraph here. The others in the first paragraph might also be a collective noun. I just want to point out as well that in no wise should you be in your essays just pointing out every single example of every single key term you've ever learnt in the text, but you should be picking out those things that are relevant to answering the question in relation to mode, field, function and audience if you're doing the Edexcel specification. For verbs then, verbs are doing or action words. We have main verbs, which describe the main action, so for example play, sing and kick, and auxiliary verbs, which are inflecting the main verb, so they set the tense, mood, aspect and voice. There's types of auxiliary verbs. The first one is primary verbs, which are be, have and do. Modal auxiliary verbs are could or can, would, should, will, must. They express modality, so they assert or deny the possibility, the certainty, the ability, the obligation of future intention and other sort of similar things of an action. Now to look at some in the extract. So main verbs, I've got examples here of walked, hoping, picked, manage and thought. This is another example, which is to put. This verb is in the infinitive form, so the infinitive is uninflected in that it doesn't have a particular tense. And now for auxiliary verbs, so we have some primary verbs here. Here I think it's more of a main the was here is more of a main verb because it describes the action of her being at the party. But here is also well, it's contracted, but it's probably perhaps also a main verb, so that probably was not a good example, I'm sorry for that. But contractions relate to the formality of the text actually, and we have one also here with a modal verb, I'll. This is a better example of auxiliary verbs helping set the tense or the modality. But informal texts generally have contractions. You're unlikely to see them the more formal the text is. Here we have a better example of auxiliary verbs. So had kept, kept is the main verb, and had here is an auxiliary verb. It's a primary verb here. It's setting the tense and the voice, perhaps also perhaps the mood and aspect. Now for adjectives. These are modifiers, so they modify the noun's properties or qualities. And you can also have comparatives, which compare the properties and qualities of two objects or multiple objects. They generally end in er, for example, prettier. Superlatives are sort of also a kind of, I suppose they compare things, but they say something has the most of a particular quality. They generally end in est, for example, prettiest. Now let's look at some in the extract. So some adjectives are great, glass, little golden, beautiful, bright and cool. An example of comparative is better, and stupidest is a superlative. Now for adverbs, which are also modifiers in that they modify the verb in terms of they sort of set it in a time, place and manner in which it was done. And they can also modify adjectives, for example, delightfully pretty. They generally end in ly, but they can be whole phrases, for example, on the boat. So here are some in this extract. So instantly, obviously modifies, well, it tells you how quickly the dormouse fell asleep. There is an adverb because it tells you sort of where she will never go again. Then is an adverb as well because it tells you when Alice did stuff. Now for pronouns. Now it's very important you remember pronouns replace nouns, and they're very easily confused with certain determiners as well. But I'll be covering determiners in a minute. So here's a table of some pronouns. Personal pronouns, you'll notice, have different forms for the first and third person singular and plurals. This is regulated by case or thematic role depending on language. It's not necessary to know what these are. You just need to know that they're personal pronouns. And now for some demonstrative pronouns which point to object. So for example, that or this. Lots of context is required here to know what it is exactly that you're pointing at. Also to note it's not that cat, it's that. So again, this is context dependent, showing deixis, referring to something in the discourse context which requires assumed knowledge of the reader or the audience. Indefinite pronouns don't refer to particular objects, so for example anything, everything, nothing, something. Relative pronouns form relative clauses. So these describe objects. They're placed after the object or the noun that they describe. So for example, the girl who is crossing the road, the chicken that crossed the road. It is not to be confused with subordinating conjunctions, which I will be covering as well. Interrogative pronouns are WH words, so who is crossing the road, what went where, those WH words. So let's look at noun phrases, just quickly, this is also a bit of extra detail which you don't really need to know. It's just to help demonstrate exactly what I mean by pronouns replace nouns, because this is the pronoun test for noun phrases. Noun phrases can be substituted by a pronoun. So, for example, the red mat is a noun phrase. It consists of a modifier, the red, and noun, which is mat. Also note that Cynthia here is a proper noun. So we can replace these with various pronouns, and also we can equally replace the pronouns in this chewed that with other noun phrases such as Jeremy chewed the chocolate bar, which are equally noun phrases. So it's important to note again the deixis of these pronouns. We really need to know the context to know which noun phrase applies here. So to look at the extract, so some personal pronouns are she, them and I. Possessive pronouns, I couldn't find any when I looked, but there might be some. Her pocket, for example, is not a possessive pronoun. Technically it's a possessive determiner, but again I said I would be covering them in a minute. Some reflexives, herself, demonstrative, this and that. Notice that this piece of rudeness at the very first sentence, this is not a demonstrative pronoun. It's actually a demonstrative determiner, which again I will cover. Compare it to just as she said this. We don't know what this is unless we refer to the context. And again, that's very curious. It's replaced the entire noun phrase. So some indefinite pronouns. So we have everything, and some relative down here, that led into garden. I couldn't find any interrogative pronouns in this extract, but again, there might be some, but they're just WH words. Now for conjunctions. Conjunctions are essentially connectives, but you can also have coordinating conjunctions which connect to clauses of equal value, so and but. And subordinating conjunctions, which I mentioned are not relative clauses. They connect main clauses and subordinate clauses. So, for example, the people prayed that they would cease. So, they would cease is a subordinate clause, and it's connected to the main clause, the people prayed, by the subordinating conjunction of that. It's not about describing the noun, which is what relative clauses do, but subordinating clauses don't modify the noun. It's very tricky to get your head around. It took me a while, but if you just sort of keep thinking about it and keep looking at examples, it will help. Now to look at the extract, so we have some coordinating conjunctions here. I suppose you could just generally call them conjunctions when they're at the beginning of the sentence, but they do connect. They're all about connecting two ideas. Some subordinating conjunctions here. Though is a subordinating conjunction, that and till. Now for prepositions. These relate two objects to each other either by direction, position or relationship. They generally form a prepositional phrase to describe exactly what the relationship is. So some examples: up, in, off, into the teapot, after her, at, in, close to and down. Just to note that the to, in, to put, which we looked at earlier, is not a preposition. It's marking that the verb is in the infinitive. Now to determiners. Now remember, don't confuse these with pronouns. So first of all, some definite and indefinite articles. Definite article is the, and the indefinite article is a or an, depending on whether the following word begins with a vowel or not. Indefinite articles generally refer to new objects or a general typical example, whereas definite articles refer to a specific thing. Sometimes it depends on an introduction to the discourse context, or if it's expected in the discourse context. So for example, if I was writing about how I went on a picnic with my friends, and a sentence that I wrote was, I pulled the tea bags out of the hamper. The tea bags have not been introduced before in the discourse context, but you kind of assume they are there because you might be wanting tea bags on a picnic. I could have said, like, the sandwiches, they haven't been introduced before, but I can still use the definite article there because I assume you as a listener or a reader have the sort of knowledge or experience to realise that those kind of things might be expected to come out of the hamper. Now for possessive determiners. So these are like possessive pronouns, but they don't replace the noun phrase. So compare my watch versus mine. Mine is the pronoun, my watch, my is the possessive determiner. Now for demonstrative determiners, these are like demonstrative pronouns, but they don't replace the NP, or the noun phrase, sorry. So for example, that versus that cat. Now for the extract, so let's look at some definite and indefinite articles. Again, thinking back to what I said about whether it depends on an introduction to discourse context, we have one of the trees, and because the wood has been introduced, we assume there is going to be trees in the wood, but there's not an assumption of a door being present in a tree, so we have here introduced using an indefinite article. So new information is not assumed. Some possessive determiners here: my life, her pocket, and her way. And demonstrative determiners: this piece of rudeness and this time. These are things I've commented on before. Now here's just a summary slide, all of the things I've highlighted in previous slides. Obviously there is more examples of these features, but I hope this was sort of a helpful introduction. It's important you could go away and do your own research as well, look at examples if you feel unclear on certain things, but you can always leave a comment below, asking questions, adding details, or just a general comment. So that's it from me. I hope it's been helpful. If so, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Remember, these do require practice, so do try this exercise with other short extracts and it will soon become a habit, so that when you're in the exam it will just flow naturally, and it will be very beneficial in your essays. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.